Buttons serve us well when they're secure to a garment. A loose button, well, that's another story. Begin by assembling the tools you'll need. Make sure your hands are clean and put a little lotion on them. It'll make it easier to handle your thread. Now take a length of thread about the length of your forearm. You're going to want to cut your thread at an angle. Take a moment to smooth your thread, once again making it easier to manage. And then you can thread your needle. Since you cut your thread at an angle, it'll make it easier to get it through that tiny eye of the needle. Now pull the tails so they're equal lengths. To make a knot in your thread, wrap the two tails around your finger and roll them off. Now, coming up from the back of the fabric, poke your needle through so it goes from back up to the front. Take your needle through one of the holes in your button. And now it's time to employ your shank maker. A shank is a tiny length of thread between the button and the garment. It gives your button some flexibility and more strength. You can use a toothpick or a pin as a shank maker. We're going to use a toothpick today. Take your thread over your shank maker and your needle back down through the second hole in the button. It's a little tricky hanging on to the shank maker and the button and the garment all at once while trying to get that needle up through the hole in the button. But be patient with yourself. You can do it. Once again, take your needle back down through the second hole in the button. We're using a 2-hole button here, but many buttons have 4 holes. If your button has 4 holes, begin by doing just what we're doing here with the first 2 holes, and then move on to the second 2 holes. Again, making sure you go over that shank holder. Now I can remove the shank maker. And you can see there's a tiny bit of thread back there. Now bring your needle up through the fabric this time, but not through the button. And just like the hands of a clock, wrap that thread around the shank. This creates a magic shield and really protects those threads, giving your button even more stability. Take your needle down through the fabric and check to make sure you don't have any stray loops under that button. Now, take your needle through your stitching and back through the loop you've created. One more time for good measure. And finally, take your needle just through your stitching and pull it tight. And snip off your threads. Hooray! Well done! Try that button out. Good job. Button sewing tips and tricks. First of all, threading the needle. You can use a needle with a larger eye. Sometimes it's just really hard to get those needles threaded, but you can use a larger eye needle for most buttons. Just make sure before you even thread the needle that that whole needle will pass through the holes in the button. Rub lotion onto your clean hands before beginning. Then you can smooth your thread. Just a tiny amount of lotion on that thread can help it stop unraveling. It's better than spitting on the thread. Cut your thread at an angle. Cut your thread at an angle with a sharp scissors. Even if you're using a nail clipper to cut your thread, try to cut it at a 45-degree angle. Then hold the needle so the light clearly shows the eye or the hole, and poke your thread through. Works pretty well. What if your fabric is torn or weak, or your button is loose? If your fabric is weak, your button is not going to stay put. You want to strengthen the fabric first with a patch. If the button is still hanging on by a thread, just cut it off and set it aside. Then you want to create a patch. So sew a piece of fabric or felt or ribbon that is about twice the width of your button to the underside of the garment in the place where the button's going to go. If you have iron-on material, you could even try that. Once the fabric is strong on the inside, you can sew that button back on. What if you've lost your button? Well, you still have plenty of options. Sometimes you can remove a button from a hidden place on the garment and use that in the more visible spot. If you want to pick a button from another part of that garment, you can sew it on, and then you can just replace the hidden one with a button that's almost the same, but not quite. Consider an accent button. Maybe you, at the collar or at the cuff, you want to use a completely different button for just something unusual. Or lots of buttons. You can replace all the buttons on a garment. It's great practice. And remember to add an extra button in a hidden place for a future button emergency. Happy sewing buttons!